Hi, Cindy. Hi, Michael.
Hello.
Cindy, I also uploaded one slide deck, I think, which is towards the end, just FYI. And Wes will be sharing, I think, his slides at the end because he's live editing. So that's the deck that he has not yet uploaded.
Okay, so
Just-
there's new slides in the data tracker from like in the last hour or so.
Yes.
Okay. I'm gonna
And this is the last presentation anyway. So you can, no need to, I think, merge all your slides. It's still at the very end. So we
yeah.
can just go to that one. Yeah. You're fine with what you currently have.
Okay, the identification of key takeaways and next steps.
Yes.
Okay.
Because there might be one more update, I have a feeling, from Mahesh and Suresh as well. So that's why I was thinking, don't merge. You keep your merge slides for the initial set. And for the end discussion, I think we can do individually.
Okay, sounds good.
Perfect.
No snark. Or is it that you guys can't hear me?
No, we can hear you. We are waiting for you to start. And we have Warren, and Warren is quiet. How is that possible?
I know that's.
Warren realized he's got email that he needs to read, so he figured he'd get that done first. Also, he was waiting to see if you all have learned how to snark yet, and he's fairly disappointed that you haven't. I mean,
We need a
very slight try.
Yeah, we need a master class.
Yep.
Like a TDD on how to be Warren.
That sounds like a good plan. You all need better hats. 1 second, let me go find a hat. Okay, so need some advice / guidance. We have a fairly boring blue one. I don't have a large collection here. We have the Indiana Jones.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
We have a Panama type thing. We've got something that they call an Afro Blondie from Australia. That's not bad. Or, because the Secretariat is awesome, from the last time in Prague,
Oh. I think my vote is on that one.
there we go.
We have
I
a
guess I'll
winner.
keep this for now, although in theory this is a serious workshop. Oh well. I'm assuming Roman would not be happy with my hat choice because he seems to think we should be more serious.
Well, we need something very next era of hats.
Indeed. Same with Miria. She's not here though, so.
Hey, Warren, looking good.
Pardon?
I said looking good.
I know.
He's got enough
boy.
compliments.
Is that a new hat, Warren?
No, the Secretariat found these in Prague. And we had a long discussion when I first joined on which the correct hat for today was. You might recognize this one from Melbourne. We
That makes you
wandered
look
off.
like Brian Trammell.
Yeah, that's the look I was going for. I mean, I'd
I have
like
the
to be
Dallas
able-
Cowboy hat behind me.
Pardon? Cowboy hat behind you?
Yeah, the Dallas one.
Ah,
Nice, yeah.
it's got the Indiana Jones hat. But I think that it's a Australian Brian Trammell one today.
I like the fact that Warren is still doing pre-meeting banter.
Indeed. Technically snark, but we can do banter if you. There we go.
We should probably get going. Today is going to be a long day, so
Yeah.
there's a lot to cover today. So if Suresh and Mahesh want to take it off, go for it.
Thank you. Thank you very much for joining this session. Like this is day 3. So we looked at the past in the first session. We looked at the present in the second session, and kind of we're looking at the future and some new ideas for that in the third session. Next slide, Cindy. So this is like the same administrator, like if somebody joining here first time, I know there are people who are joining today for the first time. So there is a workshop mailing list, so you can join that list, and the workshop will be recorded, and we will publish those recordings. So if there's something you want to say off the record that shouldn't be recorded, like please let the session chairs know. If it's a part of our session or the workshop chairs, let us know, and we can turn off the recording at some point. But otherwise, assume that everything, like you say today, is going to be recorded and published. And we've been pretty good, like with like some minor exceptions. But if you want to say something, just like put a +Q on the WebEx chat, and the chairs will call on you when it's your turn to talk. And we are maintaining some rough notes at this URL that's there. And I don't know if Dhruv's going to post the URL onto the chat as well at the same time, but these are the rough running notes for the workshop. And next slide, Cindy. And we also have a parallel document as well we are maintaining, and that's going to be for the next steps and takeaways. Cindy, next slide. Thank you. So, so the idea is like at the end of the workshop, we want to know like what are the key takeaways, like any kind of requirements that are there, and what we want to do as the potential next step. So like there's going to be 2 open discussions today, which is different from the first 2 sessions where we had like 1 set of open discussions. So we're going to have an open discussion about the presentations today. We have like 3 presentations today, one from Benoit, one from Rob, and one from Kent. And we'll have an open discussion that's going to be moderated by Mahesh and me. And then we're going to like follow off to the key takeaways and next steps. That's going to be run by the workshop chairs who are Dhruv and Wes. And as like we said, like there's a next steps sheet, like please feel free to type anything that you require, if you think requires discussion in there. And so the idea of the IAB workshop is this is not any kind of consensus. What we're going to try to capture is like what was discussed here, what are the key takeaways and stuff and so on. We're not going to determine consensus. That's like a job of some other AD, like somebody like Mahesh, who will probably like charter like follow-up work to do the big work. So he's going to get this double his pay for that. So next slide, Cindy. So this is like a high level look at the agenda. So the last session, as you see, is the identification of key takeaways and next steps. That's like for an hour. So there's like, so we are planning for an hour. Like, so if you finish the open discussion earlier, we'll get like more time for that discussion. So so this is the introduction section. We're going to start off with Benoit talking about knowledge graph and ontologies and how things are connected together. And then Kent like talking about his epiphany from like talking to a lot of the operator orgs on like, you know, what kind of things work and what doesn't work. And discussion from Rob about like, you know, how the device models look like, how doing something timely is better than doing something much better, slower. And so that's like a 1-sentence summary of the presentations, but like you'll hear like more stuff in the presentations. So Mahesh, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, nothing other than the fact that today's focus is really looking at what the next steps really are. And the discussion probably should focus more of where we want to take the whole management solution forward.
So at the end of the day, if I can stick my voice in really quickly, at the end of the day, we will be trying to, so Dhruv and I have worked on trying to collect the statements that we think probably have sort of consensus to actually go a little bit against what you said, Suresh. We are going to look at, you know, what are the conclusions that we all agree on, and what our plan is that we will continue using the mailing list afterwards to, you know, refine some of the other things and have more discussion over time about, you know, where do we go and things like that. And so at the end of the day, we will be looking for next steps and takeaways, as well as, you know, we did write down a number of things that we think were pretty consistent across the group. So we'll do that at the end of the day.
Sounds good. Thank you. Thanks, Wes. Like I didn't mean like no consensus, but we're not trying to call for consensus or anything, right? Like, so yeah, got it. Yeah, thanks. Thank you. And with no further ado, like, you know, Benoit, if you're ready to go, you can turn up. And thanks.
I'm ready. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks.
So I would like to present about knowledge graph framework for network operations on behalf of the authors. Most of them are operators, Thomas from Swisscom, Holger, DT, Dan, Bell, Paolo from NTT, Diego and Nacho from Telefonica, Brad from NBN, Paolo, Telecom Italia, Pang from China Unicom, Wei Chang for China Mobile. Why this is important to me is that it's not a vendor trying to push something. Now, this is not something new. When I look at my notes, we've been discussing this with one particular operator for already like 2.5 years. And I've been working on this for more than a year and a half. And all of the operators there have seen like code and POC and prototypes and demo of this. And that's why they accepted to have this combined position paper. So on the next slide, I could go and describe the challenges of network operation. It was mainly discussed in day 1, day 2. So just a couple of points I want to mention. Data overload. I mean, if I speak to AI and ML people, they will always want to have more data, but the fact is that there is already a lot of data. But it's very difficult to analyze all the information and to correlate information from, for example, different planes. People will be coming from, I've got a control plane issue. What changed? What's happening? Some will say, oh, I've got like a management plane issue. I see something up or down. And some will try to validate with data plane. And this is where it starts to be complex. And specifically, whenever you try to combine this with the customer you have on the phone, right, who's not going to tell you, oh, I've got this L3VPN from PE1 to PE23, and it's actually getting via this interface. So the correlation is actually difficult. Why? Because we speak about different formats. We speak about different storage. And if you look at the NOC, there are still different windows or different machines that are looking at different things, which are not correlated. And it's the job of the operator to try to troubleshoot and find the correlation between all of this information. But the context is sometimes lost. I mean, if you look at the time series, but you don't know that the router was reconfigured or that you change the telemetry parameters, you're going to get the wrong conclusion in your quest towards closed loop action. I could mention organizational silos where config team don't speak as much as they could to the operational team. I could mention the source of truth, right? I mean, we want to solve intent-based. We want to solve closed loop. And I'm asking many people, what is the source of truth? Do you still accept people changing the CLI? Then the source of truth is what? The network, as opposed to the controller? Or maybe it's the inventory? Or maybe the IPAM? But all this is not in a machine-readable way. So on the next slide, we spoke a lot about Yang. Yang, of course, right? But Yang will not be the Uber model, the solution to everything in operations. When I mention not everything is Yang, not everything is in Yang, about Yang, model in Yang, people smile because they know how much I've been pushing for Yang. But that's a fact, right? Even if it would be the case, let me observe that I could be writing from, the IDs, the spec to code to deployment, a new routing protocol, and have it deployed in, let's say, 5 years. Think segment routing. Now, think about operation. Let's assume Yang is the solution. You could double or triple the life cycle in operations because there is always an old device that you have to monitor. I remember the previous life, we had a brand new router, everything was XML. We said no CLI. Great. The first request from customers was that, oh, but all my NMSs are with MIP. Can you get me a MIP because it's going to be easier to integrate? Right. The thing is that if I want to create all information I mentioned before, we've got multiple schema. syslog between brackets because it's just plain text. Does a job, but plain text, not machine readable. NIPS between brackets because ideally would like to get out of MIPS. IPFix, different schema. BMP, well, it's just a PDU. There is no schema. If you change BGP, well, it's a new PDU. So there's a schema, but not the schema. TACAX, BGP flow spec, all these. Policies. What is your intent? Inventory. What is the inventory? I mean, it's actually a different database, right? And what is the ID in there? It could be a UUID. It could be a loopback, 0, still IPv4, right? It could be like the host name. But guess what? If I use IPFix, the ID I will receive on my connector is the IP address of the outgoing interface because it's UDP packets. Oh, so it's not the same one as the UUID I have in the inventory. Well, no. So it means that we spend a lot of time doing this costly data model integration. And it's very costly, right? Now, on the next slide, what is RDF? RDF is, and I advise you to look at this. It's a resource description framework. It's a method to describe and exchange graph data. And it's based on the idea of making statements about resources with subject, predicates, and object. This is nothing new. This is nothing new for other industries. This is new to us. This is the world of semantic web, by the way, right? So on the next slide, what I want to mention is that, well, we spoke a lot about tools, right? So at the last hackathon, we developed this tool, which is about having a unique IRIs, which is what we need in the world of semantic web, internationalized resource identifier. So unique and ideally-deterministic, right? So why do I show this? Because we've been mentioning tools, and tools are required. So I don't believe that the IETF is a good fit to just present a new architecture and say, oh, let's all work on this together. I believe more into, okay, let's do our homework. Let's see if it works. Let's do tools. Let's solve issues. And then you will get a community to help on this. So that's what we did for Yang here. And Yang is a tiny piece, right? On the next slide, this is somehow the difficulty to map config data to Opera data, right? And we have, I mean, you could be thinking, yes, it's easy. And I took a native model on purpose here, right? If we had an NMDA, all of us, okay, apparently no big deal. But just doing this, it's a huge work. And if you see this in Yang, you're thinking too small. Think about it into Yang, IPFix, BMP, you name it, right? How do you know? I mean, all of us, I see some people be there for a long time. How do you know in the MIP world that the admin status is linked to the Opera status? You know, because you know, right? We solved that with Yang, with an MDA. Now, how do you know that the IPFix ingress interface and egress interface is actually the IF index that you had in the MIP module, which is the same IF-index that you've got in Yang, right? So how do I know this? I know because I know. No, it's not sufficient. I don't know this in a machine-readable way, right? I don't know this. The junior guy will not know this, right? So on the next slide.
Now you have 1 minute.
1 minute. Oh, sorry. Okay. On the next slide, I've been showing like the napkin type of thing is always cool, right? And it was a way that I was showing to my boss what we should be doing. And if you see disrupt the ITF model, we foresaw already that Yang modules in draft and RFC would not be working. The process is too long, no CI/CD, no quick integration. That led to the open config world, right? If you want to go to the next slide, next again, what should the ITF do, right? I believe the ITF should be playing a role in this basic networking ontology. But what exactly? Well, we could be defining the format. We should be defining an architecture principle. We should be defining the networking ontology, the basic networking relationship, while experimenting with tools. But my last slide, on the next slide, is actually, what I've been in my head is that, should I even go to the IETF for this? I put like a nice positive title, let's not repeat history. The question is the IETF the right place? Right, because we need to have an iterative process. It requires collaboration, and we will make mistakes. When I learn from different industries, typically it takes like, I receive the feedback 4 ontologies to get it stable. So I'm thinking to accept this work, the IETF will have to adapt. It must adapt. Having an ontology in an RFC doesn't work, right? So it means that we need to change the process. What I start to see is that 10 years ago, we foresaw the process would not be working. With Yang push telling, like with vendors MVP 1, 2, and 3, it's bypassing the IETF. And I see here that we might be doing the same mistakes again. NMOP, not NEMOPS, is a good start with experiments. but it's not sufficient, right? I believe the process should evolve so that we have we include open source. It's like the living document that we mentioned, on the chat. That's something we'll have to adapt. Otherwise, I don't think this work will happen here, which should be a shame because ITF equal networking in my mind. And I'll stop here.
All
Thank
right.
you very much.
Thanks, Benoit. Any clarification questions?
Kent?
Okay, Ken.
Yes, hi. Thank you for this. Are you thinking to use knowledge graphs as a different data modeling language, or is it more for creating digital map or digital twin for like off-box closed loop analysis?
Forget about digital map and digital twin for now. Digital map is just one data source for me, but the point is to link information, right? The digital map, if we do a good job with that, is going to be Yang, so it's going to be easier. But linking information between different data sources, whether this is a digital map, whether this is the network, a BMP, an IP fix, a Yang, a controller, this is what we need to do to solve the higher level of ADN, autonomous driving network.
Okay, Dan.
If you can go a couple of slides back when you're showing QoS not collocated. A few more back. This one. So I will say again what I said yesterday. The tools that we have are good enough. We just don't know how to use them. That is my issue with this, because this is an implementation issue and not a tooling issue. That we don't know the basics of, and actually that we also didn't inherited the management system who can follow basic object-oriented, rules of software development. It's a implementation problem, not a tooling problem. The tools are there. You can describe the whole QoS in a data model that can have the configuration and operational as the same object. And you're reading both you read and write the config data as well you're doing the operational data. It is just that it wasn't implemented in that way. How you want to describe it, with what tool, is completely up to the implementer. I'm not saying that we have a tooling problem. We have a problem of using the old architectural styles from the 90s that we didn't evolve into the modern era of software development techniques. This is what I see as the main problem. And I'm finding some interesting blogs that saying we should be even skipping configurational templates and just using software development techniques to create the network state that we are looking for instead of the config files. So there has been some efforts in the industry to do that, but it really never took off because internally within the network community, we don't have many people who say, I'm a network engineer who knows how to code. And this is one part, how we can make network management tools easier to follow the software development techniques using some, learning from software development community that are providing no-code tools to create products that you previously had to code, and now you can do with no-code tools, you can create some very complex applications.
So Dan, we need to move to the next presentation.
Yeah.
Sorry.
That's fine.
So answer later in discussion or no?
Yeah, thank you, Benoit. That'll be good.
And if you could go, yeah.
Okay, I guess I'll take this. Next slide, please. I wish to introduce 4 thoughts for how to improve network management for operators. How is this position paper conceived? So as I mentioned earlier, I went to NANOG 92 in October, That experience surprised me. The operator's plight, it was palpable, it was authentic, it was genuine. They were seriously having issues with being able to manage the networks. And so, I started thinking, like, what can we do better to help the operators? The NEMOPS position paper that I was looking at, because I'm on the program committee, none of them seemed to address that perceived issue that I had witnessed at NANOG. And so I wrote my position paper on the very last day. I didn't spend much time. I probably should admit this. I mean, it's been thoughts that I've been thinking about for a long time, but I hadn't intended to submit a position paper, but I did just because I hadn't seen it. I was surprised it was selected for presentation. So thank you for that. Next slide, please. My bias is that I'm of the opinion that the industry got it mostly right. Data model driven management is the future. I don't think radical change is needed. I mean, how we go about modeling the data, Yang is the syntax we're using today. Maybe there's a better way. There's some discussion about an object-oriented version of Yang called Yang++. Benoit just mentioned knowledge graphs. So there may be different ways to model data, but it is the future. The data model-driven management is the future. I think that the current stack is mostly okay. I mean, there's problems in it, in Yang, in NetConf, RESTConf, et cetera. There are efforts to improve those, but it's mostly there. The issue that the operators are having, I don't think is so much with the current stack, as it, at least as it's defined on paper, but as it's implemented in code. So thinking about what would most help operators, 4 recommendations are presented. Next slide, please. The first recommendation is to focus on RESTConf and Yang Push Lite. So more generally, focus on a single protocol. Having multiple protocols fractures the community, and a single protocol should be sufficient for general purpose use. What I'm seeing, and this is actually, this recommendation is a couple steps removed, but from what the operators had said. But what the operators were saying is that they didn't have tooling, and there was too much tooling, and they didn't, and the few resources that they have, they don't know what to focus on. So it's balkanized, and we don't get to concentrate the effort into, a single solution stack that would be useful for everybody. So the idea here is to focus on a single protocol, or a small set of protocols. I think that protocol should be RESTConf with JSON. The reason being is because JSON over HTTP is ubiquitous. With JavaScript and browsers, there's a massive developer community. On the client side, it's actually questionable if there's a need for any client libraries. Most programming languages have built-in support for doing JSON over HTTP. I don't think RFC 8040 is ideal. This is the RESTConf specification. There are rough edges around it, so a V2 would need to be published if we wanted to go prime time with it. And by prime time, I actually mean to say is that it's not even limited to just network management. Any application having a northbound interface, really it's a server, right? It's managing servers, not just managing networks. And so if we could evangelize RESTConf as being more useful to app server developers in general, then there's even a larger development community. It's not just the network management community, it's the entire industry of application development that could be opened up to it. And lastly, Yang Push Lite for telemetry. This one is sort of, I mean, there may be other protocols that are better, but one thing that has been impressed upon me that is necessary for the streaming telemetry protocol, the data model for it to be aligned with the data model of the configuration. And so here we do have this notion of in Yang, the config false and the telemetry data can reflect those values directly, and it allows for the consumption of the data to be easier. Yang Push Lite does support multiple encodings, including JSON, XML, and CBOR. It would be neat to see if we can add protobufs to that for yet another way of encoding the data. Next slide, please. The second recommendation is to focus on NMDA. NMDA, Network Management Data Store Architecture, describes well the conceptual model implemented by devices. The whole notion of a running data store, startup data store, factory data store, the intended data store, even the operation, all of these are actually concepts that exist in real devices. And so aligning to what is seemingly implemented by devices makes a ton of sense. Additional benefits with NMDA include separation of running from intended enables features such as templates and the inactive flag. These are like cross-cutting features. They're not like any specific Yang data model has a template or any specific data model, Yang data model has an inactive. These are like metadata or meta functions that exist and cross-cut across all everything. And NMDA allows this with a separation of running data store from intended data store. Second is the definition of the system data store, which enables visibility and convenience. One, the clients get to see aspects of what the system can provide, and convenience because the system can pre-populate shared objects and allow the clients to refer to them in their configuration, and so they don't have to define everything themselves. And thirdly, having the same data model and operational facilitates telemetry. I mentioned this on the previous slide. I do hope that OpenConfig will adopt NMDA. Currently, the separation of the state tree in OpenConfig is different, and it is being adopted, broadly by vendors. But it would seemingly be well if it's the agreement that NMDA has benefits that OpenConfig could, if it wanted to do this, and it has how should I say the audience to go about to implement it. It's even though NMDA was published a while back, it hasn't been implemented broadly, and so perhaps this could be a way that it could get implemented more broadly. Next slide, please. Third recommendation is to focus on data model adapters. A common operator issue is that devices have a native data model, but operators always want to use common data models and quickly. Common data models, because that way they don't have to understand each and every device's native model. They get to just write to the common data model, but quickly because their needs to manage their equipment is today. Like they can't wait a year or 5 years. Waiting for vendors to implement standard models on box is slow, right? But there's no reason why adapters have to be implemented on box. It seems that the adapters could be factored out into a common shared by all repository, and that would have many benefits. One is the fact that it would eliminate the slowness. Now the adapters could be implemented right away when the need arises. And also from a specification perspective, it could be the case that as and when SDO is trying to define a Yang model, that they can write the adapters for that Yang model to a few native models, and thereby proving that common model or standard model is actually implementable or translatable. There is a dragon in here, which is that some adapters may be one way. The ability to go from an abstract model to a concrete model, you can always do the push down, what might be called the manager is the master, as opposed to network is the master. But so you can always do the push down going from the abstract to the concrete, but doing round tripping like a brownfield, and you're trying to import the config that was pushed to a device. Importing that config into the abstract model is sometimes difficult or if not impossible. Next slide, please. The last recommendation is to focus on device protocol adapters. So this is different than data model adapters. These are for protocols. So yet another common operator issue is that devices have only CLI or serial interface. We'd like to think that this is limited to legacy devices, but that's not true at all. I'm very aware of new devices that are being creating every day having only CLI or serial interfaces. It is the case that screen scraping is a necessary evil. No one wants to do it, but if we have to do it, let's just do it once. If we could have a common shared by all repository of the code that knew how to do screen scraping or to adapt from a well-known interface to the device-specific protocol interface, that would have a multiplicative or a very broad impact and benefit to everyone. Protocol adapters could have a RESTconf like NDI if it wanted to. And for instance, if with RESTconf is this notion of that there exists a Yang module, and so going to a device that has only a CLI, you could reverse engineer what would that Yang module have to be to reflect that the CLI, that the data model that the CLI that's trying to present. Next slide, please. So to recap, 4 recommendations to help operators, RESTconf over JSON, NMDA, data model adapters, and device protocol adapters.
All right. Thanks, Kent. I think we have Torlis.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ken. So I mean, I put a couple of the things I wanted to say in my position paper, which didn't show up here in the agenda. So nothing against your recommendations and those of Benoit and before, but I think they're really scraping the surface of the problem that we have, right? If I was trying to find an analogy, then it is they're definitely very helpful to build better fax machines. But we should really start to analyze, understand that that's what we're effectively doing, right? We're managing networks as if we're trying to optimize fax machines, right? Sticking to, really bad technologies and just trying to make it work better. And why is software development on routers slow, right? So why are data centers with all type of software exploding, and we're being stuck in very slow cycles, right? So we have intrinsic problems with the way that software is being built, and in the end we're kind of outsourcing any innovations from these devices because we're not overcoming them, right? And we're not trying to solve the problems of the service that we have to become easier by simply trying to solve them with an external controller that uses, nerd knob heaven to orchestrate everything, as opposed to make things self-orchestrating in the network. The whole TCP/IP internet started with self-orchestrating protocols, and we've stopped that 30 years ago, right? So, I mean, nowadays an IGP is the major source of, bringing the network down because it is remotely managed by miscommunicating nerd knobs to these routing protocols that by all means they should be able to automatically communicate amongst themselves in the same way that they communicate their routing topology, right? So these fundamental problems is what I would have had hoped 20 years after the fact to be part of the discussion. Unfortunately, they're not. We're just trying to build better fax machines.
Okay. Next
All
comment.
right. Next, it's Rob.
Hi, Ken. So it's interesting here. It's like, hey, please come. I really would like to see OpenConfig and other operators adopt things that have been defined in the IETF. And I'll tell you what, it's taken 10 years to get to where we are from vendor implementations. So why not the other way around? Like, hey, I could go through this and say, hey, RESTconf, well, we already got GNMI. I could go through and say, and it's well implemented, doesn't need many changes, open to changes if it's needed. NMDA, well, we didn't need it. Actually, super overcomplicated solution to the problem that we wanted to solve, and we already solved it. And the latter two, the data model adapters in both ways, been running them for a decade in production. So we have real-time telemetry translation. We have the same for config from model to CLI or model to native model. Super happy to help adapt. I think there's others in the chat that look at if we can open source that to help out. But why should operators look to the IETF for these solutions? Why should they not look to open to other places where they already exist, where vendor implementations are not nascent or non-existent?
Okay, fair. And I should mention the comment about adopting NMDA. It's just I forgot to say nothing wrong with the open config models as other than the state tree, being duplicate. But otherwise, the model itself, I've got no issue with that. And if we look to 3 and 4, the 2 adapters, if those were done, then almost everything else doesn't matter. I mean, if there were that ability, then if the actual interaction with the device, whatever protocol, whatever model, it doesn't matter, it disappears. Though if, to your point, the more consolidation we have or whatever we choose, it could be GNMI, that would enable those adapters to be easier to develop and faster to develop. So yeah, I mean, and you're right. It's been a decade trying to get this stuff out the door. Very slow process. It's unfortunately IETF doesn't have the same way to incentivize the industry as other communities. So it's in the marketplace and whatnot. The 2 recommendations, I guess, at the top. I mean, I would love to carry that on as a side discussion. Like, you know, huge kudos to, you know, what you've done. Like, it's amazing. And I totally resonate with things that was said in our keynote last year. I think this is actually next level, like the idea of introducing even a larger developer community and these cross-cutting abilities. OpenConfig would benefit as well from templates and inactive metadata annotations. So it actually would have a benefit to everyone. So I guess
I think I think idealistically I agree with you, but the problem is that like the uphill effort of getting this stuff implemented. So like the 3 and 4 are what you have to build to do any model-driven management. In the last, if you've done it at all, you have to build it because it's just not the device API support. The long pole for us has been like getting the device side implementations and even the interfaces to devices. So we spent years getting implementers to have a way that we could send a full declarative config that didn't involve flapping all the BGP sessions or, you know, the box crashing or those kind of things. So I think why I'm so, I don't actually care if it's open config. The only thing that I care about is that it exists, and the amount of effort that's gone into that has been non-trivial at all.
All right, so
and so I just say, how do we as a community not reinvent the wheel again?
I think good topic for open discussion. Let's continue that after the last presentation, which is around device network management. And Wilton.
Is my audio okay?
Yes, it is.
Right. Hopefully this will be a relatively short presentation. I'll try not to use all the time. So just as an intro, I think we sort of heard that from some people that the tools are great and they're working deploying this. We've heard from other people that's like the tools aren't good enough. We need more tools. And they're just using CLI and SNMP. I think there's definitely a case here that there's different operators, very different networks, different sizes of networks, and their requirements are quite different. But in terms of what we were proposing, next slide, please. What I'm saying is, I think that what we have today, in terms of what's specified and the protocols that are as designed, are mostly good enough. They're not perfect. They could be improved and made a bit better. But in terms of what we have for NetConf and Yang and things, they're sort of roughly there. And actually, I think more effort should be around making what we have a bit better than throwing this out and do something radically different. So next slide. So as I said here, is take what we have, make it a bit better. So it's definitely the case that some of our protocols carry a bit of craft, like the encoding formats. We're using XML in some cases, and whereas the industry sort of moved on to JSON. And I think for us, it sort of hurt us that we're still stuck and we should try and move on a bit quicker. When we came around to implementing Yang push, it felt like that in some cases that the specification was too complex in places, and there's bits where I was speaking with other vendors, it's like, we'll never implement those bits, they're too complicated. So again, I think a focus of trying to simplify those things and make what we have a bit better is better than trying to do something brand new. Next slide, please. I think we should be trying hard to minimize the complexity. So I think we should be trying hard to focus on the actual requirements that operators have now and making sure that the protocols cover those core requirements. And it's not necessarily covering everything, it's covering the ones that matter the most and trying to fix those in a reasonable amount of time. So not in 5 years' time, but in 1 year's time. And I think that cases where we've developed protocols and we have optional functionality like XPath filtering in NetConf might be an example, is maybe there's some people who do implement that, but I think the vast majority of the industry doesn't. And having those extra optional bits of functionality makes the entire sort of solution more complex. It'd be better if those bits were taken out and put into separate specifications, and the core specifications were shorter, simpler, focused on the core requirements. Next. Timely solutions. So without a doubt, I think one of the things we've found in IETF, and I think the Open Config is a great example of an alternative way of doing this, is that I think we focused on solving 120% in 5 years' time more than solving the 90% in 1 year. And I've been involved in some of that, like the versioning work has taken an enormous amount of time in IETF. It's hard to get a consensus. The Yang push took a long time to do it. And when we tried to evolve Yang previously, again, it took quite a long time to do that. But I think we need to somehow find a way to iterate on these protocols and on the solutions more quickly, so we can find a way of making them a bit better and getting industry adoption of those bits that are a bit better and deployed, and then move on to the next bit. So some of the work in terms of with Thomas and doing Yang push implementations, that's focused on like an MVP, a minimal viable product, on what does everyone need in terms of that set of operators, and the vendors agreeing, let's all focus and implement these features. Let's strip it down to the bare bones and implement these. And then once we've done that, we can work out what we should focus on next. And I think that's the right solution. I'm not quite sure how that ties into the ITF RFC process, though, in terms of then doing these documents that everyone's agreed and implemented, and then those specifications can change potentially quite radically further down the line once they've all been implemented. So that's something that needs to be worked on. Next slide, please. For me, I think for it to be successful, it's important that we have like a full and open engagement. I think it hasn't really worked when vendors are getting together, or maybe it's only one or two vendors, and they're pushing a particular solution, and the operators are trying to consume that and then saying, well, this doesn't really work for us. And at the same time, I'm not convinced that doing it the other way around, where having a small set of operators drive what's being specified and saying to the vendors, oh, you just have to suck this up and do this, is working well either. I think we need to get to a forum where everyone has a fairly equitable voice in some senses, and get to the point where everyone can have their concerns heard, and make sure that everyone buys into that process and gets full engagement. So I think that's important to making progress here. And so I think ITF's disadvantage is it's always been very slow, but maybe we can make that better, make it faster. But one of its core advantages, I think it's always been good, is this sort of openness of input and ideas from everyone, and everyone's voice is being heard, and it's been considered. Next slide, please. So I've covered this fair amount already, but I think we should try and simplify where we can. Like JSON's simpler than XML. Running code for operators is definitely simpler than RFCs, and it is for vendors too. If there's a library we can use and the code is open, that's much better for us to use, and it's decent quality than it is for us to write that code again. And that applies to everyone in the industry. So I think, again, we need to focus on how we do better with that. Solving the industry's problem, I'm not sure in the ITF how we do that. And again, the ultimate here is, although running code is good, I think having both the open source code and a stable specification that goes alongside that is the best of both worlds. And again, having code leading and the specification sort of following after, again, is not great, or vice versa. You need to get the two hand in hand. And we've already discussed this before. I think ideally, if we could get down to one ecosystem rather than two, that would be great. That would be best. At this moment, I can't really see how it's going to happen. So that's unfortunate, but that would be where I would like us to get to if that's possible. Next slide, which I think might be my final slide. So what am I proposing? So one of the comments that Rob asked yesterday, Rob Shakir, was saying, why are the implementations not better? And that's because implementing what we have today is already quite hard, particularly in terms of models and mappings, and the fact that many of these older devices have their own internal management models that they're trying to map onto. So it's already quite complicated in terms of what we're doing. I think we should focus our energies on doing that better, making the tooling better, and making some small improvements to the protocols and the language to try and make them a bit better, tweaks and things to make them a bit easier to use, but don't try and throw them out or go in a big direction, because it was going to take the industry another 20 years to move on to what the next great big idea is. Instead, we should be focusing on what we're doing now and just sort of executing better in a more iterative, agile process. I think that's everything to say. Thanks. Questions?
Thanks, Rob. Any questions for Rob?
Rob,
Okay.
you're still clear.
All right. With that comment, I think we can move into the open discussion forum, and I think we had some initial seed questions that Suresh is going to seed the discussion with. So I'll let him. And I think this kind of follows a lot of the discussion that has been happening both in chat and on the mic. Feel free to pick up any of the questions and see what your opinion is.
Thank you. So I just put up like a couple of questions along with Mahesh to kind of reflect both the presentations today, like what we heard, and also what we think, like, we should kind of drive towards the key takeaways. But first of all, I do have a question for Rob, like since Rob might leave earlier. So well, you can like take a look at the questions when that's happening. But so I think like Rob, I had two questions for you, like based on your comments, like on Ken's presentation, right? So the first one is you talked about NMDA, right? Like, so was the decision for OpenConfig to do NMDA, was that not use NMDA? Was that done because of some technical things you insufficiencies like you identified, or was it because like it would take too long, or what was kind of the thinking behind not going NMDA?
I mean, so if you look at where NMDA came from, it came from the like draft netmod OpenConfig upstate requirement stock, right? Like we raised the problem space, and the discussion then when there was a side meeting in I don't know numerous years ago where we were suddenly trying to design a solution that had these tens of data stores and had here's how apply scripts are going to work, or here's how like all this stuff that we didn't care about, and we needed to ship something. And I think I blogged about it at the time that said like, look, we have to come to a decision that's implementable quickly and doesn't require all this architectural change. And there was a huge I would say today, I still see vendors struggling with getting any kind of multiple data stores, even for like, we've got this idea of a boot config, which is a persistent thing. It's just not implementable either, or hard to implement. So getting to the full MDA looked like a decade's work. And so we actually just stopped engaging on it because we've kind of made the point a few places, it's hard to get operators to engage. And we had like 10, 15 people from operators reviewing and writing models. And we weren't going to spend that effort on arguing about NMDA and the right data store approach. We wanted to solve that to get towards the business problem we had, which was having models that were workable and usable. And because at the time we were pre-implementing in these translation layers, we were implementing translation to non-standard models, non-stable schemas that weren't modeled, and that was a big problem for us. So that's where the decision kind of came from. I still think the solution is too complex.
Okay, cool.
All right.
Is the blog stuff something you can share, Rob? Like
let me find it.
Yeah, thank you. And the second question was, you talked about GNMI like instead of RESTConf, right? I think one of the questions is really going to be about governance, right? So like if let's say the Google and other config operators come to the IETF, right? Are you kind of willing to let the IETF take the governance of it? Is that because I think that was like when Benoit and I were on the IESG, that was like a big question, right? That kind of wasn't clear where that was going to go. So I do appreciate you offering that out, but I just want to throw that up as like a question. Is that something that's acceptable? So thanks.
We actually tried to bring GNMI to the IETF. And so like let it be noted that we actually tried that. And I think a more open governance model makes a ton of sense, right? Because today there are, you can see if you look at the pull request, there are things that we don't have an immediate requirement for, like I don't have an immediate requirement for, that are of interest to other vendors or operators that would benefit from more review. We've actually asked, or like we've driven from OpenConfig, having vendor engagements with different folks to be able to do that review. I think we'd be open to it, but the risk of doing that today is that like every change becomes N years work. So like, is the IETF prepared to provide us a process whereby we get the same velocity? Cool. Okay. Sounds like we got, if that's a yes, then we would avoid many of the pitfalls that were the problem.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks.
I think next we have Dolus.
So yeah, I have a more general question. So I haven't heard in the past days anything related to virtual routers, network virtual function, but I can see that more and more of routing and networking functionality is done that way, right? In POPs and other places. And then I'm wondering how that is being managed, right? And I would assume very much that the management tools being used there are not the same as on traditional routers, but maybe more so all the different, management mechanisms that data centers have built and that I think are very successful. And if I see that even more and more of the physical routers can be replaced by standard software packages based on Linux that can be managed through these things, I'm really wondering if these improved fax machines, if that's what I may still want to call them, are still not going to be made irrelevant by others in the industry that are using different paths, right? So what's the insight of people here about especially software-based routers? And what their manageability is going to be in the future. Are we having chances to, overtake how they're being managed with, our better Yang mechanisms?
That's an open discussion, I guess, if anyone wants to. Otherwise, we do have Wes next in the queue.
I can respond to that if I'm sort of allowed to jump in. I mean, I don't think that what you said is sort of representative of how things look today. I think that virtual routers largely come from the classic vendors, the same vendors that produce physical routers, and the virtual ones look very much like their physical ones from a management perspective. They implement the same protocol. It's typically the same software running on it. It's just compiled, slightly differently. So, I mean, I think the whole starting point is entirely different. Those virtual routers are, in fact, managed. I think that's the sort of majority. Of course, there are more specialized cases. I think, maybe Rob Shakir can talk about what, Google is doing internally. Amazon probably, building their own devices, right? What does that look like? I mean, they have their own routing suite, the OpenR, right? This is entirely different. I suppose they're not interested, but I don't think that the industry is going to converge like either way here. It's probably bipolar, right? It fairly stable for, most people's career, right? In this call, it's my belief.
Just 4 words, sorry, to add. Internal Google devices are managed using GNMI and OpenConfig.
Okay.
So we have some convergence towards this, and we are pushing that in Sonic.
All right. Wes?
Yeah, so I'm going to tease more questions out of this. I'm not making a position or a statement. I'm going to challenge everybody to really think about where do we go, right? Vendor feature development always outpaces standards in general. And that comes from agreements taking time. So if we think about the path of how stuff gets through the IETF, right? Some vendor creates a new idea. They bring it to the IETF. The protocol is worked on, it's standardized. That takes a couple of years. Complexity is added in the process, with speaking to that first bullet. Then a network management model is created on top of the existing protocol. That takes another couple of years, and complexity is added to that again. There's a couple of really good examples. Quick, I think, is a good example. Google created Speedy, brought it to the IETF. How long did it take, the IETF to standardize Quick? It took years, and it's widely deployed now. The good news is it's actually a good example. The spin bit alone, a single bit, is notorious for taking like 90% of the conversation, right? RPKI was actually more developed directly in the IETF, and it took a ridiculously long time to get that standardized, and it's still not. The deployment's finally getting, pretty solid, but BGPsec on the other side is not at all, for good reasons. So my point is that defining common ground, takes time, and defining a management interface to a protocol takes even more time. And it seems like we all agree that those time frames should be shortened. It's like, that's the one thing I've heard a lot of. It's like the timing takes too long. So how do we do that? And how do we do it without, say, a couple of vendors agreeing to sort of short circuit the model, so that they can develop something that is, without a larger discussion where we don't get the opinions of the operators, we don't get the opinions of all the vendors that might eventually implement it and stuff. You can push stuff out really fast, and then it becomes the de facto standard. But that has its own dangerous side, that one vendor is really driving what everybody else should do. So those are my questions. Good luck.
There's like a silence rest, but let me, we have Kent now in the queue.
Oh, okay. And this was a comment that was made by the operators as well that I heard at NANOG. I mean, that the vendors are, creating vendor-specific knobs and they're highly prized. Definitely, they're producing software solutions, and they're not being managed. But the matching gang module doesn't exist. Some vendors actually use model-driven CLI. So as they're creating the internal feature, their internal Yang module, they're using Yang, is actually updated, but it's the native Yang module. It's not a standards model. So this is where I think it was my recommendation number 3, the model adapter framework. So I'm thinking we should just let the vendors do their native Yang modules as fast as they want to, to the extent that they can be competitive in the market. But then off box, we have the ability for operators in the community to develop these adapters to map to them the best they can. And there's the rub, right? How well will the adapters map? And so if there could be some sort of site, I mean, where you can get statistics about which for a given standard model, which devices are known to be mappable, and it could be like a good mapping, a medium, good mapping, not a good mapping, or no mapping exists at all, and so and thereby encouraging the community to develop these off-box adapters. Maybe not as fast, but definitely faster than asking the vendors themselves to implement them on box.
All right. Next, we have Tolas again.
Yeah, just to Ken's point. So obviously, I think external adapters are a tool that everybody who sees that it can help them is using. The problem is that as soon as the external adapter comes from a different vendor, like an integrator or another third party, then you're going to have this whole synchronization process between software versions of the vendor and implicitly changing behavior there, which is one of the beauties of CLI, and somebody on the third party trying to track that, right? So I think we should certainly distinguish between adapters from third parties and adapters from the vendors themselves.
Okay. Rob?
I wasn't going to talk about adapters. I was going to talk about should we focus on a single protocol, RESTconf. And I'm not sure we can. So ignoring the open config versus IETF ecosystem split, let's put that aside and just talk about the IETF protocols. I think if we look at RESTconf, NetConf, and CoreConf, they have sort of different places where they are being used and are popular. And so I don't think trying to move the devices away from NetConf is a good idea, because I think that would just cause churn unnecessarily. And I'm not sure we should say let's ditch RESTconf and only use NetConf either. I don't think that'd be the right answer. And again, CoreConf's got very good reasons for why that looks different. So I'm not sure we can do that. I do think that we should try and make as much of those protocols as similar as possible in terms of the semantics, and define as much as possible in Yang itself where we can, maybe extending the language to support that, so that the layers over the top of it for RESTconf or CoreConf or NetConf are quite light, so that so it's much easier to implement those rather than having less code at the top. That would be my proposed solution.
Okay, I put myself in the queue mainly to go back to Wes's comment about, okay, where do we go from here? And I think on the point that we want to make the process faster in IETF, or maybe with the help of IETF. And that's also a comment I put in an email. I want to see if there's any proposal that people would like to suggest on how ITF could do better in terms of churning out changes faster. And if anyone is willing to sign up to even write something down to make that happen. Dan?
The answer to your question was in Rob's Wilton presentation. We have to change some of the processes and saying like, look, we don't need an RFC for every single iteration of a young model. So we have to, and this has been discussed in the ITF now for almost 10 years, that we've been discussing, do we need an RFC for every single model? And there were several people that are on this call who were saying for the Yang models, we should just go through a open source development and iterating for them and keeping them in the GitLab and then we can decide at which point to standardize them. But hey, let's try to have a consensus on any source repository open system that is available out there. And 10 years after, we are still discussing the same thing. Should we do it? So
Okay,
some of those things are when we will decide to do some of the things and just move forward with it. I'm still saying here is that one of the things I like about the intent-based networking is how can we make sure that the intent-based networking works better with the existing systems? Because for people, if you create an intent, you can then translate it into you should be able to translate it into any underlying implementation. This logic you have to develop, but I think adopting more of an intent-based approach into network management would be the right thing, and we have to learn to create more abstractions or more intents. Right now, we are mapping knob to knob every single one out of there, and we are saying this is network management. Yes, as a vendor, you have to do that because you're giving all the features, but not everyone is using all the features on that box because it's technically impossible to use the same features. You have to decide whether I use one feature or the other feature to achieve the functionality that I need. And I don't know, as an example, translating, I want to create a multi-VRF BGP configuration that will manage my underlay and an EVP and overlay network would be, for example, like, hey, let's try to see if we could create more of an intent-based model that could translate such an intent into the right right network state on the devices. Again, Rob was talking about that. Rob Wilton, Rob Shakir, Benoit. Let's see what would be the approach, what outcome we would like to get for the network management, and then we can figure out are the existing protocols and tools that we have sufficient in order to do that, or what do we have to change? Rob Shakir was saying, let's go through the iterative approach. Rob Milton was saying, hey, let's get 90% solution, even a 70% solution done in year one, and then growing from there is better than waiting for years, like we tend to do in the ITF to get something done, especially in the network management space. Some of the other areas in the ITF are much faster with iteration. They go from them much faster and they release the results much quicker. Some of them are more slower, but
so then
we could change the process.
Okay, I think we get the point. And before Rob, since you're next in the queue, I just wanted to say, yes, I do agree. It takes time and ITF to make changes, but to propose a change, we at least need one RFC. And let's hope that doesn't take 10 years to approve. But Rob, you're up next. Rob Wilton.
So I was going to, yeah, thanks. So I was going to talk in terms of processes and things like that. So definitely we just have to change this. I think in terms of how we produce YAML models in ITF, they've got to be taken out of RFCs. What the RFC should represent is something along the lines of not an informational model to the point where you're documenting everything, but the rough structure of the model, like a 10 pages or something for BGP. And everything else just goes into YAML models that are managed in a GitHub process, something that's sort of much closer to what OpenConfig is doing, and some reasonable balance between managing those projects in OpenConfig between like a very stable version and also like a sort of reasonably stable and the cutting edge. So you can sort of get the changes in, and then once a year you say, okay, this is now a stable ref point for these models for the next 2 years, and then eventually when things become very stable, you then sort of say, okay, now we publish these and make these cast in stone or something, or more like that. So people can choose what level of stability they want in terms of what they're developing. I think that where and I think the OpenConfig process is working well here, other than the fact that the OpenConfig process models churn at a higher rate than we are able to catch up and implement them, I think, by and large, because a lot of the vendors are trying to catch up with the models anyway, and it goes back to this whole issue of doing this mapping is inherently quite a tricky thing to do. If you've got better infrastructure to do it, it becomes easier, but writing that infrastructure is not easy. There's nothing open source as standard for how to do that. So that's sort of a tricky thing to do. So I definitely think we should be trying to fix the process. I'm not offering to write the draft to suggest that. I think it's going to be a painful thing to do. Maybe I'll have a go if I get time, but I think it's going to be hard to drive that through. But it's also not just about the models. And the question again with the models is the industry going to implement ITF device YAML models? Otherwise, why are we spending our time on it? But also in terms of evolving the protocols, the same thing applies there. It's not necessarily getting to RFC is the right solution. We should be having a process that allows us to say, okay, this is like a stable version. We expect it to be reasonably stable for the next year or two, and then we'll publish it as a formal RFC in 2 years' time. Now, you could say, let's use the experimental annotation in the RFC and put it through as an experimental, but then current ITF process, there's an expectation that experimental is an experiment, and you have to say what the outcomes of that experiment is going to be, how it's going to be modeled, etc. So that sort of pushes you away. But there should be some way of saying, I've got something I want a stable identifier. It needs to go through the process in a fairly lightweight way without much churn and review that's going to change it through the process. And then be able to get those published as a sort of generally stable thing, but without saying this is going to be locked down, not changed for the next 5 years.
All right. Thomas?
Yeah, to answer your question, Mahesh, I think there are, I think, 2 things currently missing. If you recall, on the first day, Jürgen's presentation, where he tried to pull up a table to find out all the references of the documents, and he admitted it was very difficult to do. You probably also heard from many implementers that it's sometimes hard to find all the necessary documents to do the implementation. So I think there is one gap on the tooling side where we could do a better job to link all the different documents together for a particular implementation. And second, since we want a living document, an iterative development, we also need to have a way of having a document which can steadily be expanded, extended, and revisioned, and that's currently missing. And one last point we didn't talk, but we see in front of us about, and I think it's quite important, is how can we encourage earlier implementations, especially open source. And here my comment is we have 3 kinds of responsibilities at ITF. They are represented by operators, vendors, and academia. Academias are our future colleagues. And I think vendors and operators usually they're not much contributing on the open source itself, because vendors are typically developing closed source software. And I think we should encourage and sponsor and support academia in this incremental development to basically do this trial. Let's try out this now new code, see whether this is implementable or not, and get this closer feedback loop much more quicker.
All right, thanks for that comment. I think Next, we have Suresh.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. So I think like really good points about the velocity not matching, like, the IETF publication or RFC, and I don't think it's going to change, right? So part of the attraction of the IETF is this like cross area review. So it's kind of at odds with the feature velocity. So I think one of the proposals, I think like Warren brought up, like on the IESG, this must be like 6 years ago or so, Warren, like, if you remember, just come back with it. Right? So there's a living document, and like Rob, like you said, right, like there's some kind of stability label that we throw on, right? And that could be decided per area or per working group, like when something is like stable enough for implementation. I think that's something we can run as a process experiment to kind of make sure that we can probably spin up a working group with like slightly different rules where we say, hey, this is like a implementable version of the draft, and we kind of want interop in there, right? Like it's something we can do kind of as a process experiment. And I was totally for it. I don't know what happened with that, right? Like, and I think it happened just before COVID. So that could be like one thing that went off, but I'm totally supportive of like that kind of experiment to be run. And probably I can do a presentation at All Dispatch with Warren and take some arrows for that.
Yeah, I'll quickly chime in. Yeah, I did a huge amount of work on the living documents idea, and it went through multiple different iterations, and it ended up just getting stuck in the standard IETF. Everybody's got a view on process and stuff. If you're willing to help, happy to try it again, and maybe we can get out the door. It seems really useful for things like this.
Sounds good. I'm in, Warren. Thanks.
All right, thanks. We have a commitment finally. Wes.
Yeah, so I like this thread and where we're going. So I'm going to pull on the devil's advocate side of things, right? Which is when we are looking at comparing sort of the rapid development of stuff, let's look at how it's worked for other ecosystems. So from like the Python and Perl, kind of framework ideas, right? The libraries underneath the hood change very rapidly for modules being developed for, Perl for the older language and Python for the newer ones. Required versions change frequently. So like, this thing requires this other thing and it requires a particular version. APIs are generally deprecated quite rapidly and developers are expected to keep up. And backwards compatibility to a large extent seems to be somewhat of a non-goal. Whereas in the IETF, it's like once we standardize something, it's not really expected to change. So in the software world, it seems like virtual environments and containers are sort of actually almost required to achieve, module separation, where this program needs this set of modules and this program needs this set of modules with a completely different versioning requirement. So can operators really be expected to follow that level of churn that well? And that includes, I guess, network management vendors as well. I really like the idea of a segmented experiment to find out if that's a good idea, right? So then it comes to the question of, okay, what do we sacrifice for that experiment? It's like, what niche do we pick that is willing to go forward and say, I am willing to go through a high level of churn to make sure that this isn't an issue?
Wes, and I know even Rob is suggesting dot numbers for RFC. Very interesting ideas on how to get a bunch of models working together. Next, I think we have Dhruv.
Yeah, hi. So a good thing is like we kind of are converging on this experiments idea. But one thing also to focus on is, can we do some things at the working group level and the area level itself, rather than always thinking that the process needs to change at the IETF level? There are a few things like, with respect to what we do with RFC editors and RFCs, that is definitely at the IETF level, but a lot of things about decision about what we adopt, how we work, how we will go from one version to another, that can actually be done at the working group consensus level. That this is how we are going to do iterative design. This is how we are going to decide the minimum viable product, that some of the ideas that we have talked about. Instead of waiting for IETF level change, can we build consensus among the NetConf community and the RESTConf community, and even bring back the Yang list that we used to have, where we were discussing Yang across routing and ops area, and try to build consensus there first and try this out before going to the IETF overall? Because we know when we have gone to the IETF overall, we have tried, it has failed. So maybe trying a smaller experiments at the working group and area level is worth exploring.
I like the suggestion. Yeah. Dan?
So I would differentiate here between models and protocols, because for the protocols, you need a little bit more stable environment than for the models. On the models, you can iterate much faster to see what it works, what doesn't work. You can say these are the basic building blocks of the of a model. Let's say a filter or an access list model. You can create them from, these are the 5 major elements that have to be there. Now, every variant, every attribute that is part of those building blocks, they don't have to be immediately specified in there. And you can do that even as an open source model, saying, look, as long as you're keeping within those 5 parameters, like between those 5 major building blocks, you can try different things out, see what works better, what doesn't work better. And then once we get to the solution that it seems like much better working, we can say, oh, we can now produce a version 1 or version 2 of that, of that RFC that created the initial state. With protocols, I would be much more conservative than what I would be with the models, or even with the APIs that would be directly changing the network state on the device and throughout the network. This where on that, changing the network state on the device, whatever is exposed by the vendor, I would feel very comfortable trying things out without needing to be standardized. But the protocols, this is where you have to be more careful in order to do that. So I would definitely make some differentiation between, hey, what do we want to add to netconf, resconf, coreconf versus what do we want to add to Yang or any data modeling language that we decide to use, and what would be then the data models.
I think a good point, Dan, that distinction that you're bringing up. We should keep that in mind. Before I let Christian speak, just want to say there's 12 minutes left in the open discussion. If there's any other topic we want to discuss, do bring it up. But on to you, Christian.
Okay. I have a lot of things to say, so I'll use those minutes. No, but I think a lot of good things here, right? And I mean, I think that a lot of these ideas are actually compatible. I completely agree with you, Dean, right? That there are differences between when we define Yang models and various other protocols, right? And I think for the protocols, it's better, right? I think this hurts a lot more for Yang models, sort of the way that we're working in the IETF. It's just painful. And I mean, I was one of the early contributors or participants in the open config, right? And I mean, I think it is simpler, right? The world has largely converged on how to do software development, right? At least open source software development. You have GitHub or GitLab repo somewhere, and you accept pull requests. It's very simple. I mean, you lower the bar to contributions significantly by doing this, right? And I just very recently became aware of these. We have these RFCs in the IETF talking about like how can you use GitHub for your RFC drafting process, right? And in there, I found this, and I quote, "It does not mandate any processes and does not require changes to the processes used by current and future working groups not using GitHub," right? So we're very careful about this. But the thing is, I mean, the ironic thing is that the process that we have in the IETF is so much harder than this, right? And I think that's really painful. So, I mean, I would like to change that, right? I mean, living documents, I would like to have normal software development processes and tools very early on, before things are published as drafts, right? So every little change that we do go into Git essentially. And this whole thing with it being distributed and you get to pick your own Git repository somewhere, I think it's just, I don't see the benefit. I think it would be beneficial if the working group or maybe even the IETF had a single place. I know some people won't like it, but that's what I think. And I think it's a pity that it's so reluctant to change this. And I would be happy to participate in something like this. Also, I would like to just sort of like +1 on the translation adapters that Kent is talking about, and I think that that could actually be very useful in so many different ways to turn the IETF Yang device models into something useful, or whatever device model it might be, but also as that part of an implementation, right? When we're drafting a new device model, having device adapters could be that first step into an implementation and sort of seeing, does this model actually make sense, right? We get to implement that and can do it lockstep with the model. I'll let someone else comment.
Thanks, Christian. I think, Thomas, you had a response from Dhruv's question.
That's perfect timing. I wanted to follow up on Dhruv's question and also feedback on what just Christian mentioned. So Dhruv asked about what we can do on a working group level. And one suggestion is that we should favoring documents which are having open source implementations over documents which doesn't. So if you're already coming early on with an individual document and you have a running code proving that this document is actually implementable, we should favor that document because the possibility that we find acceptance and it is implementable is much higher than a document which doesn't have running code.
All right. Torles.
Yeah, maybe one line of thought to, maybe it's possible to figure out some ways to bring more, people to the Yang party outside of, basic network router infrastructure. Maybe, higher level on the application side of the IETF, because the larger the community, the more agility we may create from the ones that can act faster. And I think they're more in the application layer than the network infrastructure. One crazy, idea that I thought, was an idea in that respect is that we were talking about the whole green stuff, and I was saying, well, if we would be the first ones to distinguish, let's say carbon versus non-carbon energy consumption, then maybe even, people would want to adopt that Yang model on their servers, which are 90% of the power consumption in data centers, and nobody else seemed to be doing that. Unfortunately, that carbon differentiation didn't come into the current charter of the Green Working Group, so we're not going to have that opportunity. But that's kind of a marketing idea, right? We're innovative in the IETF. If we do something that goes beyond routers through the management chain, we may be able to get more people to our Yang party.
Okay. Suresh?
Yeah, thank you. And Christian, I really like your point about the centralized thing for getting these things for a working group, right? And this is something that the IETF actually did do. So there was this GitHub integration and tooling working group. It's called Git, confusingly. So it's kind of hard to find a Google search, but they did publish an RFC about what is the best practices for that, right? And I think that's I don't remember totally, but I think Med posted an RFC number, but I think that's the one that talks about the, how you kind of go about doing this for a working group, right? And I think it's got some good advice. So if you kind of decide to go on a working group path, we can kind of look at it and try to do it. And when people talked about Quake, and everything, so the GitHub stuff was there. So there is still some ideological things about GitHub that doesn't work. One example is they don't do V6, right? So there's a lot of people who do V6 who won't go there. And they have this issue with 10,000 stars, right? That they won't fix kind of things. So there's some ideological issues with GitHub, but I think the other part of it is the community is there. So to your point, right? If everybody, I think the size of the community really helps, right? And we do certainly have at least some best current practices written down, and we can certainly follow it up if Mahesh kind of wants to push this forward.
All right, RFC 8874 for those who want to look at it. By the way, yes, I've used GitHub extensively myself for draft development, and I think I would look forward to any ideas on how to do Yang code development also as part of that. But that's me. On to Binwa.
So following on that, right, call it working using GitHub for Yang, call it living documents. We heard it multiple times from different people here. And I was reflecting on Drew's question, is there something we could be doing at the working group level? And actually, I think this is an up-specific issue, right? If you speak about routing, it's something different. It has to be precise as a protocol. So the question I'm asking myself is, did we ever receive pushback on this proposal from ops people? I don't think so, right? I think the pushback might be coming only from non-ops people. So to me, if you arrive to that conclusion, this observation, the conclusion is that we should have our own process. I mean, we discussed a lot about OpenConfig versus IETF. In the end, I believe ops has to do what works for ops. So Mahesh, maybe there is something to conclude from that. Whether this is an experiment, which is easier or something like that, and say, you know what, ISG, I don't need you to validate a Yang module. Actually, your review is not that useful. Okay, maybe it is, but it's too late and it doesn't matter. Right. So maybe I'm making the point hard enough to make people react. But coming back to the last one who said it, Christian, and we heard it from Diane, we heard it from me, we heard it from Rob, from you, from Warren, who, everybody. So can we just try it? And non-ops people, sorry, but when I was ops AD, you were not my customers.
I can see Rav Shakir is also smiling at the whole idea that they've been doing this for years with OpenConfig. Why is ITF not adopting something similar? I think,
course,
yes,
I mean, OpenConfig, I mean, if I would be in Rob's and Google's shoes at that time, I would have done the exact same thing, obviously.
They've done that. They've succeeded quite a bit with their experiment. I think I'm open to the idea of at least running it as an experiment with an ops. So Wes?
Yeah, again, I love the discussion we've had today. I think it's been interesting. It's interesting that we've concentrated more on how to do standards than we have concentrated more on what is actually, how do we do network management, right? If we go down that road of doing an experiment, I think one of the key critical elements would be how to get operator involvement, right? I mean, Benoit just sort of alluded to that, and I want to state it much more conclusively. Operator involvement in the IETF has always been in waves. Actually, at the 2003 workshop, it was sort of probably at its peak then. We actually had a lot more operators attending the IETF in general than we do now. I think it's creeping up a little bit right now, but if you look at the overall trends. So that means when we're talking about, do we get pushback for what the IETF is developing by operators? Well, we may not, because they're not here, right? The survey that we gave clear indications that there's a decent number of people that have no idea even what the IETF is, let alone all they do is read. There's very few that do participation. So I think that is a strong element that we need to figure out how to fix. And if we could do it in the experiment, that alone would be a huge win toward the success of an experiment. So with that, I actually see no other comments. So one of the questions next is, do we want to transition at this point to sort of Drew and I? Yes, okay, they're done.
You get 1 extra minute, Wes. We gave you 1 extra minute.
Okay, if that is the case, let me share my screen. That is not the... And so this is going to be the Let's Stress Wes Out for an hour, because he loves live editing. It makes him giddy and excited.
Wes, do we want to do the other thing first before we come to the conclusion?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, sorry, Cindy, would you mind sharing this thing? And we'll try to be quick because we want to focus more on what Wes has planned. So I'll try to do this quick. We just wanted to give an opportunity to folks to just have a recap of where we are. Are there any missed conversations from day 1, day 2, day 3 that we should have talked, but we didn't talk? And also, some of the work from our operator surveys that we have done, which we still wanted to discuss just for a little bit time, and then we will move on to Wes. So Cindy, would you be kind enough to share?
Sorry, the notes page, is that what you're asking to share?
No, the slide 6, which was on the data tracker.
Okay, 1 moment.
Which has title 6. Yeah.
And thank you, Drew. I got lost in thinking and forgot that segment. My bad.
Yeah, it's okay. I can also pull in if... Thank you so much. So as I was saying, let's move to the next slide. So this is the final hour of our workshop. We have 3 things that we are doing. Basically, we want to just have a quick think about, did we miss some conversations that we should have had when we were thinking about past, present, and future? We have some recommendations that we have received from operator outreach, so we wanted to give a small amount of time to just go over those recommendations that we have collected from folks who are not here. Some of them who are not here, who were there at the operator events, and we wanted to include that as a part of our conversation. And then finally, Wes will take over with the high-level conclusions. And as usual, we will always have open mic to have our final thoughts about the workshop. So let's move to the first discussion. We'll try to be quick. Next slide, please. So this is just a reminder of when we started the workshop. These were our key objectives. We wanted to review how things have happened since the last workshop, identify barriers. There was a lot of discussions on the notes page, so thank you for that. Thank you for feedback that we have received so far. Some requirement collections. Med has been leading that thing, and he has been collecting that. That's been useful. Please continue to provide feedback there. And finally, the day 3, what we have discussing, which is more focused on what's the future like, what are our plan of action, what can we recommend to the ITF and IRTF among us, and some of the conclusions that Wes has been working on, that would be where this discussion belongs. Next slide. So before we finalize this thing, this is just some of the things to think about. What did we miss during this conversation? Are there still some lesson learned from the past that we are not capturing? So just have a small discussion about that. So people who want to talk about any of this, please queue up, and we will try to keep this discussion short. So if there are things that we have missed, things that we haven't talked about in any of our presentations or the discussion, so this would be a thing to bring up at this moment of time. Any lesson learned, any requirements that we haven't talked about. One thing that also is a concern is we did talk about requirements, but we didn't talk about maybe how do we prioritize them, and how do we say which are the most important things for us to work on. And I think with respect to recommendations and next step, we had pretty good discussion, maybe more focused on the, as Wes was saying, on the standards side. But I think this could be a time for us to also think from the network management point of view, what are our recommendation or next steps that we haven't talked about. So let's just have a think, is there anything that we feel that we missed? If not, we can actually move on to the interesting discussion. So please queue up. We will wait for a second. Otherwise, we will move to the next discussion. Yes, Mahesh.
Right. It's not so much that we missed this question of on tooling. I think to me, what was not clear was from a tooling aspect that everyone complained about, or lack of tools. What was not clear is what was missing. And if there are people who have particular thoughts on what are the tools we should probably focus on as for network management, that would be helpful.
Anyone want to answer that? Christian?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so I think a lot of this is really about implementation, right? And I think that what we really need is to be able to bring together the people doing implementation. So I mean, the stuff that we're talking about here, changing processes, making it and essentially making it possible to, you know, implement things easier. I think that is really really important. I mean, I do have very specific ideas on lack of network management tooling, right? I mean, I think there should be a system that implements the things that Jürgen has mentioned. How can I manage my network in you know, using a deterministic, composable, reproducible, verifiable way, right? And there are no such tools available, really. And I think we should have, right? But perhaps then more importantly is how do we go about getting them? And I think it is about bringing together people that are interested in working on this. I think it's very interesting to contrast the way the IETF works with what I think of much more contemporary working groups like the Facebook Telecom Infra Project and similar, right? Where a lot more focus is on code and implementation, right? So I'd really like to see change there, right? And when we get the right people together, then I think we are better off solving these things and actually get implementations of the standards that we're writing.
Rashid?
Yeah, so just to a different twist on that answer, just to take, I know people have mentioned it a few times, but if you take Yang Push or Yang Push Lite, if I'm using a vendor and they implement Yang Push on the server side, and I have to write from scratch something in the client, whether add it to NC client or to Go netconf, whatever, that's, you know, it's for operators that could be maybe a bridge a bit too far. Whereas if there's at least a reference implementation, whether it be an NC client, let's say I don't use Python, I use Go, at least have a reference implementation I can look at what clients should do, and I can do stuff on my side. But just having no client code makes the bar a bit high. Thank you.
Benoit?
Right, so regarding tooling, we have to ask ourselves which tools and for which audience. But the biggest question behind those is who's going to pay for the development of those tools, right? Because as I mentioned via email, we all want to have the free lunch. The operators, yes, they would like to have a controller like Open Daylight, which is free, which does all the job. They would like to have like IETF or OpenConfig or whatever standards model to manage the devices the same way so that they could even replace one vendor by the other. But the question is, who's going to develop those tools? It's easy for us to conclude we need more toolings, right? So I've been doing hackathon for a long time, but I mean, it costs money to someone to send people to the hackathon to do developments. So who's going to pay for all of these? Right. I even heard like people telling, oh yeah, we should have like the NSO adapter for free. Right. Great. Sure. Ask NSO, see the reaction. Right. So main point, who's going to pay for that?
Yeah, thanks. While we continue with this discussion, I think the one thing to focus on is like, think about what we missed. Some of these conversations is, yeah, we missed some subtle points about the things that we had discussed, but are there any broader points that we did not discuss? That would be worth discussing as well at this time. So next, let's go to Wim. Wim? Okay, let's go to Rashid and we'll come back to him.
Yeah, so to answer Benoit's question of who's going to be paying for that, I think, I mean, hackathon is great, but a day and a half every 4 months, you know, doesn't cut it to get those tools going. But I think where hackathon can bring people, okay, together, if you get more operators there, and let's say there's 2 other operators, and my current employer go, yeah, we're using this library, we would like this Yang Push Lite functionality there. I know we all want a free lunch, but we won't get it. But at least with the pooling of resources, it's going to be much easier, I think, sell than to say to my employer, and you need to give me 2 people full time to work on that.
Wim, are you back? No, Christian.
Right. I mean, so to answer Benoit, I think the operators are right in the end. I mean, I think there are already projects, open source projects and otherwise, that attract people, where people do spend time at their employers. You know, they're paying for it, right? And I do think maybe I'm a little optimistic here, but that we can do something similar. We just need a sort of a rendezvous point, something to rally around, and I think this would be a nice home for it, right? We'd write the specs, we'll write an implementation for the things that make sense, right? In some areas, this already works, but here we are, and I think it could do well with a bit of a kickstart. Yeah.
Thanks. Wim? Wim?
I'll just add something, right? I mean, I am in my current role, I mean, contributing to open source already, right? So I mean, and I know a lot of other people that are similarly in network management, but I think it would be nice with a more sort of official looking project, right? Which the IETF could certainly do, and it could attract participants.
Thanks. Tolis?
So yeah, I think my main question would be, what should routers do better than more Yang models, right? So what do we need to do on that level of the problem space? Obviously I gave some answers from my side, but I think that should be a broader discussion. And then the second, kind of, let me put it more funnily. So I've entered for in 20 years, the next meeting, what should we do in the meantime? Right, so the process question, because obviously I don't think, you know, an interval of 20 years is working for this.
Thanks. Alex?
Yeah, I was looking at the topics that are discussed here. So you're asking about the network management requirements for the future. And I think a lot of what we were discussing is just making stuff that we already have better. So it seems that it's basically very much an extrapolation, and basically if only we had better Yang data models, better tools to use them and so forth, that would fulfill all those requirements. And I'm wondering, is that actually true? I mean, clearly this is one important aspect, but what I didn't see discussed here are, for instance, topics such as, for instance, do we need more intelligence in the network? What about correlating stuff across the network, basically doing things basically better holistically, managing things better at a large scale, perhaps additional mechanisms that go beyond just data models here. And so I'm wondering, is that an area where we missed something? I don't have specific things to point to, but certainly regarding, for instance, intelligence and putting certain smarter capabilities in the network is one thing I've seen discussed in the past. So, but not here. So, is this no longer needed? Is this that is all that we need? Basically, just better Yang instrumentation and the tools to feed all the information up, and are we done here? So that's a little bit what I'm wondering.
Good things to think about. And with this last question, Wim. Wim?
If you're having audio issues, you can feel free to drop your comment in the chat and we'll record it as what you would have said at the mic.
Yes, let's move ahead. I think we have less time, so we tried. Let's move to the next slide. And with this, I will give Kent a chance to go over some of the recommendations that he collected based on various operator feedback. And there is a big list on the notes page. Please comment there. But just to save time, we ask Kent if he can pick a few key ones to talk about. So off you go, Kent.
Yeah, thank you. And I just dropped a link to the notes page for those who want to look at it. There is a much larger list there of recommendations at the bottom. Okay, again, we had these outreaches to the various operator conferences. We collected a lot of insights. And then for each one of those insights, the question was, well, what can we do about it? Like, what is the reaction? Like, here was the statement that was made. What's the actionable takeaway? So we started looking through those, and now these takeaways, these recommendations are not from the operators directly. They're like reacting to what the operators said. First off, before going to any single one of them, and by the way, this is a very small sliver of them all, the quick takeaway is that the recommendations are not for any specific audience. I mean, whereas RFC 3535 was very focused on what can the IETF do better, this list is targeting many audiences. Like, for instance, for everyone, for the SDOs, for operators, for the IETF, for ambassadors and vendors. And there's even one for academia. I didn't put it on the list, but someone in the chat window mentioned a desire for reaching out to academia. The point is that we're a community, and working together is in my key. That's the key takeaway from the recommendations, is that they're not just for any one particular audience. On the screen, I just cherry picked very few small ones, but for everyone, continue focusing on data model driven management as a means to achieve automation. For SDOs, reintroduce running code as part of the specification verification process. For operators, be actively involved with the running code efforts. For the IETF, recommend a solution stack for common use cases. And here, I mean, like if there's big IP, big router type solutions, and there's constrained solutions. So, try to recommend a stack. And again, the idea is to consolidate and make it easier for everyone to corral around a common solution. Ambassadors, the word here used to be for media, but for but everyone can be an ambassador within your own environment. It's not just for media outlets themselves, but evangelize the recommended solution stacks, to the extent that we think that they're correct. Try to evangelize them, and maybe they'll get more uptake, right? That's one of the biggest issues, is that the IETF or the solutions aren't being picked up as much. And then for vendors, support the recommended solution stacks, to the extent possible. And some of the comments here were like they tried, but the implementations aren't perfect. Like, they try to do Yang, but it's not actually, the code actually doesn't do it right. So, some sort of certification suites or something like that may be needed. So anyway, there's a whole lot more recommendations on that page. And I already know that some have been modified by others. And so it's a living list, if you will. And so thank you for the opportunity for let me share the slide. Thank you, Drew.
Thanks, Kent, and apologies that we didn't have time to go over the full list, but thank you for your work. I see Dean, one question, and I think we limit to single question here. So Dean, go ahead.
I somewhat disagree with few points there. I definitely disagree with a recommend the solution stack, because we can recommend an architecture, we can recommend an approach, but I wouldn't go in recommending an implementation one over the other. Because solution stack, when you say solution stack, is I would provide examples or things like that, but I would not say, hey, this is the solution stack that we recommend. And the biggest problem to get operators to give us more information is we have to say what is the business value for them to participate in the IETF. It is not that the technical people are making that decision. It's the accountants that are saying IETF is waste of time. I heard from several in the last month, I heard from several big operators where they said our budget for IETF participation has been removed because our business folks don't see a value in participating.
Just a quick response. When I said solution stack, I didn't actually mean implementation, more like an approach, whether it be the protocol or the modeling language, et cetera.
Okay, thanks for a pretty good discussion. And now let's go to the main part, which is off to you, Warren. Oh, Warren, I'm saying Wes. Sorry, it's late. So Cindy, you can stop sharing, and I think Wes can share. Perfect.
You're muted, right?
Yeah, Wes, you're muted if you're speaking.
Yes, I'm muted. Okay, so everybody can see my slides, right? WebEx actually doesn't do as good of a job of showing whether you're succeeding at that or not. But so, thank everybody for coming. I found that the last 3 days have been fascinating to listen to, especially trying to come up with stuff at a higher level. So I want to try and see if we can find some common ground. So the goal of this discussion, right, is we have a lot of people from very different communities, very different opinions. That's okay. That's actually intentionally, we wanted to bring people from different places together. I'm wondering what are the high level, conclusions that we can come to, right? Not what's this leaf on this Yang module and whether it's good or bad. Much, much higher level than that. And I am looking this time for some higher level IETF consensus. So one of the things that I'm going to be looking for is, what do you disagree with? What is there actually not consensus in the room for some statements that we will strike them? Eventually, this will lead into sort of a future workshop report. This is not going to be all the content. I need to make that really clear, right? We will put in things that we heard both on the, the stuff that people agreed with and stuff that people did not, so that we get sort of the breadth of feedback. This is just the framing for, is there a set of stuff that we actually did agree upon? So as we go through this, I want everybody to feel free to suggest, if more, if you think that we're missing some. Dhruv and I kind of worked through these of which ones we think had potentially starting consensus. I'm sure we got it wrong. I'm sure that there's stuff in here that don't have consensus, and I'm sure that there's stuff that we missed. So please do suggest, if you think that there actually is consensus on something, let us know. And as a reminder, this is just a starting dialogue. We really encourage the continuation of some of these topics, especially the ones that we don't have agreement on yet, on the mailing list. Right, the workshop is over person to person, face to face. That does not mean that we can't keep a discussion going. So I broke this statement sort of into 4 categories. I'll go over each of the slides really quickly first, and then I'm going to come back to the first one and we can pick through them. So the first one is basically on ecosystem conclusions. In other words, what does the entire network management framework kind of look like? I'm not going to, you probably shouldn't even bother reading them entirely yet, because we're going to flip through them quickly, and then I'm going to come back to this one and we'll start with this one. But this is really network management as a whole, right? Then we're going to get into protocol conclusions, like what does the protocol that we need actually look like? There's been discussion about netconf and things that are missing, and is RESTconf the future and that kind of stuff. Again, we're looking for stuff that we agree to, statements that we can all stand behind, essentially. Then we'll talk about modeling too, right? So there is a separation between a protocol and a model, and we'll get to that. And then finally, we'll get to, I think what we've discussed a lot in the last hour is what's the standardization process for making this happen, going forward. So let me go back and we will start with the ecosystem conclusions. So we'll read through them. And I think that the way that I want this to work in the chat is, give a +Q, and ideally with a number if you want to talk about it, if you think it's wrong, and we'll discuss it. If you think it should be stricken, because you disagree with it, I want to know that. So, number 1 is the current network management protocols, models, and tools still fail the ease of use requirement that we've talked about. It seemed like everybody said, we're not there yet, right? The overall ecosystem is still fragmented. We still use SNMP for monitoring. We still use CLI for access stuff. We still use screen scraping, excuse me. Model-driven network management is generally a success. That mechanism has worked for network management as a whole. Documentation on how the network management ecosystem works is lacking. In other words, it's still hard to figure out how to get started and where to go, in the bigger picture of stuff. We have standards, but people don't read standards that well. And then easily usable network management tools for operators are needed. And that includes sort of 2 sub-bullets, which is, the open source is really the barrier to getting something out and deployed. Network operators, I think we heard from the operator community, feedback sessions that they really like to have open source tools available. And then we need more discussion about tooling as a success path. That actually came out of the last hour, so I added that one late. So with that, we'll start with Suresh on bullet number 1.
Yeah, thanks, Wes. I think like I kind of agree with the first point, but there was a side point that was brought up in discussions, both on the list and like on the discussions, is that if the tools are good, if the tools are good and easy to use, it doesn't matter if the protocols and models are like a bit more complex. I don't know how you want to capture that, but I think that's something I've seen as a theme when people
Okay,
talk.
do we think everybody agrees with that? So that
I don't know.
the
I'm just
tools
throwing
matter
that
more
up.
than
Like that's something I heard multiple times. So if you throw that up, like maybe somebody can like, if they disagree, they can come back with it. Thanks.
Okay, interesting. Okay. I will try and keep the numbering consistent, by the way, and not add stuff in the middle, except that some bullets are okay. That Thomas you want to talk about 5.
Right, just a quick one. I would add that basically we need to understand which use cases are being addressed with the tools. I see still like some development happening without having real use cases behind.
Okay, that makes sense. Tools need good use cases. How's that?
Exactly. Thanks.
Okay, excellent. Dean?
I would say that SNMP and CLI, those are the major problems because the network operators are resistant to, when you mention them, you will have no access to the CLI. The panic starts among them, and you know there is everybody is like, no, we need the access to the CLI, and this is breaking a lot of things. So that is, in general, the biggest obstacle to accept the automation and the model-driven network management. I've seen it, I heard it so many times. When you want to remove CLI access, it is like, no, we need the CLI, we need the CLI, we need the CLI. And tools need good use cases. I wouldn't say tools need good use cases. I would say we need use cases in general based on which we will be developing the tools and the features.
Yeah, you almost need example scenarios that the tools will solve.
Correct.
Type of thing.
Yeah.
So I'm going to work on better wording when we put them into the document later. So I'm trying to put down notes of what we're saying more than exact word. I don't want to get into wordsmithing, but. All right. Where am I? Let's see. So that was Dean. Torlis.
Yeah, also on point number 2, this reminds me a little bit about the state of IPv6 when we were trying to kill IPv4 with Sunset v4, right? And
We're still
we've
doing that.
evolved since then. And so maybe, step back and say, we haven't figured out what to even think about fragmentation in the ecosystem, right? Maybe there needs to be some degree of acceptance of CLI and SNMP in certain areas, which doesn't mean we also, of course, need to do everything with Yang, but we shouldn't waste resources in trying to get adoption where it doesn't really help us, right? So new staff will use Yang. I don't see an issue, but like everybody who is happy with their IPv4 addresses, right? Let's try to figure out only, what we must migrate because it blocks other things.
Yeah, and I think that's, you're spot on that's a general problem through everything, right? CPE devices don't get updates, therefore they're stuck in whatever they were, done 20 years ago. Good point. Let's see, Alexander, number 2.
Yes, I think also to point 2, one thing that I'm missing in this point is actually mentioning of Yang and RESTconf and so forth. Is that part of the overall ecosystem as well?
So no, I don't. So protocol and models are going to come next. I will say that, remember, we're looking for statements that everybody agrees upon, and so I have heard differing opinions about whether netconf and Yang are, the only solution that everybody thinks is correct. I think that we've actually heard evidence that that's not the case. So we absolutely need to put those types of thoughts into the workshop statement, but they need to be bounded with other people think that, you know, OpenConfig and other mechanisms are potentially better. So as I said, these are statements that I think nobody note that nobody has said strike one of these, right? That's actually the goal. We have clarifications about them, but nobody has said this is absolutely wrong.
Sure. No,
So
I guess sorry. Yeah. I guess the question is regarding I guess the question is regarding fragmentation. But I mean, you're singling out only SNMP and CLI. There are these other things, and I agree actually with what you said. But I would argue that they are part of the fragmentation of the fragmented landscape as well.
All right. So you would like to say the multiple, you know, the fragments are SNMP, CLI.
Yeah, you can say,
NetConf,
yeah, and
EPC.
others. Exactly. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Okay. Good. I don't see any more people in the queue for this slide. Oh no, there is. I'm sorry, Benoit. Sorry.
Yeah, I can help
Yes, please.
track the queue. Yeah, Benoit, go ahead.
So on number 4, because there was not much feedback, so I'm wondering what it means. Documentation for how network management ecosystem works is lacking, right? I was trying to remember who said that and how we arrived at that conclusion. And also I'm trying to see, okay, if I would act on this one, what do I need to do? So maybe just point to the fact that I don't understand the statement.
Yep. Okay. So let me throw Kent under the bus. Kent.
Okay, great. I was just thinking, yeah, this is actually something Scott Robin, I think his name, you know, at NANOG, he had mentioned, and essentially that there wasn't enough marketing material, if you will, to share. It wasn't easy for the operators to understand what to do in terms of like tutorials and anyway, that's kind of where it came from. Does that make sense?
So more training?
Training, marketing materials. No, I mean, training sounds like a live session, but you know, it could just be static web pages, but more.
Somebody said in chat, I think, that reaching out to academics environments to do, you know, educational outreach to operators was something too. So, okay, that's good. I will note that we do want to move on to other slides as well. So let me cut the queue after Thomas, but Ian, you're first.
Yeah, in response to Benoit's question, we had a comment about this, or we had a slide about this one, trying to sort of, if you weren't there when the things were developed and you haven't seen the whole modeling ecosystem, it's kind of impenetrable coming at it new from the outside. We've got these service models, we've got network models, we've got device models. How's this stuff intended to work together? RSJ 8309 tries to tackle this for service models, but it kind of, it seems like it's pretty much out of date. And what we kind of perceive is that as a result, people say, well, I use this stuff for talking to devices, and then I use other APIs, other protocols, or whatever for modeling my services. And, you know, I think that could be much, much better described and understood in a way that was much more accessible.
Okay, thank you. Christian.
Yes, it's roughly the same as Ian is saying, right? But I mean, I think that some of the original ideas, you know, the core people involved with NetConf and Yang, Jürgen showed these, you know, declarative, composable, etc. Right, the other day. Where is this documented? Where is this described, right? Because I think there are proposals today happening that are contradicting those sort of original ideas or concepts behind this. And I think it would do well with having it better explained or described in architecture.
Okay. Thomas, I think you get the last word on this slide.
Right, just on number 4, I think deployment guides, like which use cases are best addressed with which tools and documents and protocols, something like that to get operators quickly started.
Okay, good. I'll note I'm trying to follow the chat too, but the chat will be saved and we'll read it all later. So I'm sorry if I missed some things. Let's go ahead and go on to protocol conclusions. So here is where you'll see, you know, NetConf is mentioned actually in 3 different things, but So the 4 protocol conclusions are: 1, that netconf configuration has been successful in some larger scale deployments. I think we heard from some operators that smaller scale deployments, they're not using it, which doesn't mean that it's 100% everywhere. And I'm sure there are larger scale deployments that are also not using it. Netconf is really not used yet much for monitoring. There's definitely, I've heard a hope that Yang push, might actually help turn that around a little bit. I'll note that after the 2003 workshop, the goal of netconf was actually not to do monitoring at the time. In fact, it was sort of almost explicitly, left out. We really wanted a configuration solution, and netconf, that gets back to my dog with the dog on top of the car, right? We were going to have multiple protocols, and I was concerned, and that's exactly where we ended up. Not necessarily a bad thing. Full device control and configuration still requires CLI and screen scraping. Part of this comes in that there isn't, we'll talk about it more on the modeling page, but there's not complete access to all knobs and configuration yet, often because of vendor specific features and stuff. The important takeaway for this is that even with the protocols that we have, we are not getting, you need more than one protocol to actually get a complete solution for your network a lot of the time. And then full coverage of netconf support on devices is missing. In other words, not every device supports netconf. That's not surprising considering it takes a long time to roll out. So with that, we will go to Thomas and number 2.
I would change number 2 from netconf to Yang in general. I mean, netconf was the first iteration to get monitoring data, and Yang pushed the second one. And I think we are still stuck a lot on SNMP.
Well, aren't they really the same? I mean, so you're not wrong, right? I agree that netconf, I actually thought I capitalized all this. Sorry about that, but it's really both, right?
What I see is basically that a lot of operators trying to go Yang push, but falling back on to netconf, because netconf is well established. It does it, but it's still poll based, right?
Yeah, and so is actually much of Prometheus and Node Manager, or I'm blanking the name of it. The Node Exporter and the black box from Prometheus are all built polling based to a large extent too. That's actually an interesting one. So let me put that down as a new one, right? Polling based solutions are still what is deployed. Where we might get better telemetry in the future. Torlis.
Yeah, from what you said, maybe something like, it's better to have a vendor-specific Yang model than a standardized MIP, right? So in terms of we should try to be able to make compromises to accelerate migrating to our direction, right? Not all or nothing.
Right. So I'm going to come back to modeling in the future. I did try and split them apart, so this is really mostly about the protocol side, but your point's valid. I don't disagree with it. Christian?
I'd really just like to note here that so some of these, I mean, I'll sort of disagree with, from my perspective.
No, please.
Like, I mean,
that's what I want.
Very large deployments, being essentially only netconf Yang, maybe GNMI, but then it's Yang model for streaming telemetry, stuff like this, right? So I mean, it's completely fine. So some of these statements, like you have to use CLI and screen scraping, it's like, no, you can run large networks with lots of devices and not use that at all, right? But I think overall, I mean, I still understand that there are many networks where this is true, right? But somehow, if we're aggregating data, I think it's important to say that as well. But I think even more importantly is that I believe the trend here is a very positive one, right? I mean, I've been doing netconf Yang for a decade now, pretty much. And I mean, I think the trend is clear, right? A few years ago, I couldn't upgrade my ISXR routers over netconf. Now I can, right? I couldn't create crypto keys over netconf. Now I can, right? So like for all the devices that I know and see, like we are nearing coverage, right, with Yang. And in many cases, it's also not, bound to netconf. You have other Yang modeled transports, GNMI, and it works just fine, right? So I think that trend is, and so for us, do we need to do anything about this? Yeah, I mean, I think it's working quite well. I mean, the industry is chugging along, and we're getting better at this.
Okay, interesting. I like that approach. Let me try and do it this way. So I think one that might go on the ecosystem slide of there is a trend toward there's an increasing trend toward the use of netconf and Yang. So let me do it this way. I'm going to put that in the chat.
And I'm not sure where this one goes. I was thinking, considering this before, so I'll just say it here, right? One of the really large sort of thresholds we had early on was that netconf required sort of a rewrite of the management systems of routers because it was transactional. It wasn't just like, you couldn't just take a like thin veneer and slap on top and like, now it speaks netconf, right? It was like major rewrite. I mean, Nokia literally rewrote their entire thing, right, from scratch. And so, I mean, that's massive, right? And we spent many years in the beginning doing that. So that compared to these protocols that we're talking is minor, right? If you want to support RESTconf, NetConf, sort of same thing, as long as they have the transactional semantics under the hood. So I think that's a real win. And I'm not sure if we want to tie that to NetConf here, but like something that went well after RFC 3535, I think it's that.
Okay, I think those are excellent points. I'll think about the transaction one, and I'm going to go to Darren. But in the meantime, I dropped a sentence in chat that says there's an increasing trend in the use of netconf and Yang, and specifically reply to that trend reply to that thread if you disagree. So what I'm looking for is that a consensus statement, right? That's the point of this discussion. Is that a consensus statement we all stand behind? I actually don't have an opinion personally. So let's go to Darren.
Hi, yes, yeah, I just made my reply in that thread, but yeah, and with the operators I work with the most in OpenConfig, most of them are using netconf and Yang for configuration, at least in some hybrid mode, and then GNMI for streaming telemetry. So GNMI as streaming telemetry is pretty popular, even when it's not used for configuration. And then yeah, the full coverage for either using GNMI, or netconf for config is often hindered by just the lack of model support. So if you can only configure, 60% of what you need with Yang, a lot of operators give up on that. But for monitoring and telemetry, it's a lot easier to achieve, 60% of your telemetry streaming with GNMI and have a hybrid, SNMP or CLI scraping solution.
Yeah,
so
I think that this takeaway of the ecosystem is fragmented is I think very clear. So I put your comments under that. I think that's where they go.
I'm not sure,
okay,
and I'm not sure it's such a bad thing either, as other people have mentioned. Like, I don't see a big problem in writing Yang models that work on netconf and GNMI. I think that's not really a major issue. So choose the tool you want. I don't see that as a big problem.
Right. Okay. Benoit?
Right. So it's about 2, 3, and 4. Right. So yeah, right. So we heard from Holger, from Ian, sorry, from Darren, Christian, that there are some successful large-scale deployment, right? But there is like a nuance here. It's whenever you say it still requires CLI screen scraping, the nuance is that big developments, they are successful, some of them. But as we mentioned for smaller networks, there was first of all the documentation gap, where to start. It was mentioned by Ian. And Warren mentioned yesterday or the day before, like for smaller networks, it's not worth it. So I would make an extra nuance to that statement. And maybe it's part of what you said, there is an increasing trend in the use of netconf and Yang. And then you could make the difference between large one that are successful and smaller one not yet worth it or difficult.
Okay. So let me follow that on with a return question. Is which of these statements do you believe is false?
Full device control configuration frequently requires CLI and screen scraping.
Okay. So that means, so when I'm marking it as false, it means we will leave it out and it won't be listed as a conclusion that the group, agrees on.
Listen to the entire audience, right? Not only me.
Oh yeah, no, I know.
So it's not needed. Sorry, I have to do plus Q.
It's okay, go ahead.
Okay, so you don't need it, but it's heavily wanted. You can go through a full automation project without needing CLI and screen scraping, but it is heavily wanted by the operators.
Yeah, that is fair. I'm not going to put desired yet because I'm not sure that I've heard that, exclusively. So if you want to suggest that, put it into the chat for a sentence you want to add that you believe we have group consensus on. And then for people that don't think we have consensus on that you actually haven't heard that they want netconf, then respond to that, right? Okay, so I think we are, let's see, so that was Dean. Kent?
Yeah, I said 1 and 2, but it's really just 1. NetConf for configuration has been successful for some large scale. It says some larger scale. So, I mean, I see RESTConf being used oftentimes as the northbound for the orchestrator controller type system. And orchestrators and controllers are often used to manage large scale deployments. So I guess maybe, it may not be the last mile, between the controller to the device could be NetConf, but RESTConf is used northbound. So I don't know, maybe it's a, maybe you could clarify exactly what you meant by where the NetConf is being used as,
So I'll tell you what I'm going to do that nobody's going to like, right? That's my goal today, is to make everybody unhappy with me. NetConf. So, originally, I think this came out of the notes, says NetConf has been for configuration has been successful. And then I tried to clarify it a little bit to say, well, in large scale deployments, because we definitely heard from some people that they're not using it, right? So I tried to put a positive spin on it, and I think I've failed. So I think it would be better to actually just completely remove it, because we haven't come to agreement yet that it is sort of, the widely adopted, accepted solution. That doesn't mean that it's not used. It doesn't mean that other things aren't used. It's just that's not a consensus statement that I think that we have agreed to make in this group, because I think there's disagreement about what's being used, including RESTConf, right? There's not a single protocol that's used for good or bad. So I don't think we can make a statement that says netconf versus RESTConf versus, OpenConfig versus whatever. Let's see. I think I'm at Torless, and then Warren, and then we're going to move on to
I would have said number 1 is true if it would have said netconf for service configuration has been successful, right? In my position paper, I was trying to make a simple binary distinction between provisioning the network infrastructure so that it can be managed and has connectivity, and then the services you put on top of it. And, I'm obviously arguing that we need to, do everything better for the network infrastructure. But when it really comes to where the money is, then it is the service configuration, of which there are continuously, many, many instances that need to be reconfigured. And so I would say that, we want to concentrate on making the service configuration, work completely with netconf. And I think we're very well in that direction in large scale deployments, maybe not in smaller ones. But then, of course, it also means that number 3 to me is true, right? So when it really comes to the basic configuration of routers, all the minute device specific things for which we don't have, even standard Yang models, that is something where you need CLI. And if you don't do provisioning, but you're doing troubleshooting, you need screen scraping if you want to automate that, right? So,
Okay.
thanks.
Thank you. So I think that we're beginning to frame stuff. So I think one of the things that we'll do, just to warn everybody, is that we'll drop some of these on the list afterwards. It's like, we didn't quite come to consensus. Let's figure out, if we do have a statement that everybody will stand behind. I think, Warren, you're going to get the last word on this one, and I'm going to switch slides here in a second.
Okay. I mean, I think that 3 is very much true. I think that we've been looking at this through this sort of like large operator or large vendor model, but there's a massive number of devices which don't support netconf at all. Like, for example, Microtech and Ubiquiti, I don't think do. Huge number of term servers don't, and people still need to use those. There's also a lot of small like network operators still require this because they don't have other tooling. I'll also point out that the statement says frequently requires, and I think that is very much true. So I don't quite understand the false there.
Well, the sad thing is I inserted the word frequently, trying to tone it down from like always or whatever the word was that I replaced before. I will note that I'm not shocked, right? If you look at statements 1 and 3, they're opposites. So it would be hard to say that we have them both. So to come to the conclusion that neither one is quite valid. So we only have 10 minutes left or 9 minutes left. I want to go on to, I'm going to skip the modeling one only because, we've talked about it a lot already. And I want to get back to, I think, stuff that we may have come to agree on today, which is more about the standardization, right? So more rapid model development procedures are needed, faster than what the IETF does. Maybe there should be a new approach to how we do stuff and not put it in RFCs. More focus is needed on the scalability of all network management tools, be it monitoring, configuration, or notification. Scalability is a primary concern. We should reduce the complexity to a minimally agreed set of core features. I actually wonder if this one will hold water. That's true for protocol and models. Network management enhancements need to be backed by operator use cases and vendor buy-in. In other words, we shouldn't be doing stuff that isn't going to be used, and that's a classic IETF problem, IETF wide, right? That's sort of where the running code kind of comes in. And the one that I wrote down from earlier today is, a rapid development experiment would be an interesting challenge, or to take on, or interesting maybe approach would be a better word there. So I think that last one in particular, I think we've agreed would be a good potential path forward, and I look forward to that being tried. So with that, new queue, who wants to say one of those is wrong, needs changing, or we're missing something? Christian.
I disagree. Maybe my interpretation of number 3 is wrong, but I think the protocols that we have now are fine. I don't think that we need to that we must simplify them. If this is for new things, then yes.
Yeah, thank you. Let me interrupt to say I think that you're right. I was meaning future, not to remove stuff out of existing protocols.
Yeah. Okay. Then I agree. So no disagreement.
Right. No, thank you. I really appreciate that. You're making me realize I sort of blew the wording for that. Now it doesn't read as well, but that's okay. Thomas.
Yeah, I think on number 1, we also need to put the timeline into consideration. So we need to be more predictable. It's not only about being faster, but also deliver on time.
Interesting one. Okay. Torlis, I think.
Speed is fine, but problems are differently difficult. So, simple problems need to come out of the IETF faster. But I would hate to let it number 1 be stood without such context, right? Because that then means that more complex problems are getting kicked off the roadmap of the IETF.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting takeaway. I mean, simple ones. You note that nowhere in here did I say, nowhere did I talk about stable. I mean, one of the arguments I was trying to make earlier today is there's a balance between stability and speed, unfortunately. All right, anybody else? Dean.
So we are doing automation, but we are really not doing programming. And then we don't have the unit test for the automation scripts that we are doing. So this is the reason why CLI is needed to be able to verify if there's a problem, because you are doing the unit testing using the CLI. a change of an approach in providing some additional examples for that would be very useful to the people, how to create network configuration changes where they can unit test the outcomes and making sure that they're applying really what they need. For today, we're using the templates. We make sure that the templates are working, then we are filling in the templates, but we should be removing that approach and trying to focus more on a modern software development techniques.
Right. So I did, that's actually a good transition. We're actually sort of at a queue, which is good. So let me jump back to the modeling one, which actually had sort of what you were saying, right? Network configuration needs to be verifiable. So we need to make sure that things are working as expected. And you just said that maybe a CLI is needed or something else is needed. I would say monitoring is needed in order to verify that something is working, right? There has to be a path to get from I pushed out this change to that's what I expected, right?
Yeah.
So we'll take 2 minutes to go. I'm not going to read them. You read them and tell me if you think there's something you want to jump out, but otherwise we're going to conclude on time. So. Benoit.
On number 3, this is better service models or more service model, because we heard from Ian that he was quite happy with the L3P and it covers all the cases. Question.
Okay. I change it to more. I think that's a fair change. Anyone else? All right. So obviously, we will take, we'll post these slides. These slides haven't been posted yet because Drew and I have been working on them, live in the background. So I think, we will take them and we'll post them as well as maybe we'll post the list as well. And people can suggest or add to them on the list. We will continue to iterate, of course, over time. So I want to thank everybody for coming, and I want to say the IAB in particular thanks you for participating in this important discussion. That was an interesting follow-on to the one of 20 years ago. It's both interesting to see how far we've come, and in some cases how we haven't moved at all. Right, some of the problems are exactly the same as Jürgen was just saying in the chat. Right, but both the workshop and the live discussion have been fascinating, and I think that the mailing list has also had a lot of activity in the last 48 hours, which is fantastic. I'd love to see that continue. Thank you very much to the program committee members that actually helped put all of this together. It could not have happened as well without everybody reviewing papers and making comments and helping put the agenda and frame everything together. Drew and I have greatly appreciated your work. Thank you greatly to Drew. He put a lot more energy into this than I am, so I get to say thank you to him more than he gets to say thank you to me because I get to cut it off. But as a reminder, next steps will be, continue on the mailing list. If I haven't mentioned that 3 times in this slide, then I'll say it again. We'll begin sort of documenting a workshop report. The IAB workshops always end in a workshop report. I think Jürgen was the author of the last one as an example, and it'll be published on the IAB stream. There will be discussion about it at the Architecture Discuss mailing list, as well as we'll publish it when it's written up by the program committee members and IAB members. It'll get announced on the mailing list. And then finally, the whole goal of this workshop has been, can we provide advice to the IETF and to the IRTF, to the NMRG within the IETF? And I think that, hopefully that there's some conclusions that we can provide them, and let alone, we just spent talking about the conclusions that are likely true. There is a bunch of stuff that's not yet fully, it lets us know where the problem spaces are just as much as where we've come to agreement. So the problem spaces to some extent are more interesting. With that, Drew, anything you would like to add?
No, thank you. I think you covered everything. Thanks for this is one of my favorite workshops that I've attended, and it's been pretty good discussion. Let's continue that, and more work ahead for us with workshop report, as well as getting a consensus on this NEMOPS conclusion list, because that's the most important next step for us. So thank you, everyone. Thanks for being here for all 3 days. This was very enlightening, personally.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks everybody for coming, and we'll talk again in 20 years. Just kidding.
Yep. Thanks, Drew and Wes from the ops area, Warren, and I would like to certainly look for that input from you guys.
Okay.
Thanks, guys. Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
See you on the list.
Thank you.